We've defined an information ecosystem as a set of sources, senses, artifacts, organizations, and individuals. One regularly consults to gather information, evaluate claims, estimate likelihoods, or just when pondering the adequacy of one's worldview. And so when we think about those sources, what properties suggest themselves as properties that we would want to have those sources exhibit? And first, probably the most obvious property that we would think of would be accuracy. We want the information that we get from sources to be accurate. In the chapter and in this lecture, I break down accuracy really into two components, two important aspects, and they're both dispositional properties. They're properties that manifest themselves over time. They're not just one-shot kind of things. And the first property is the notion of reliability, the idea that there is a consistency. A source consistently provides you with true information, a well-evinced information, and you want that. That's certainly a strong component. That's what we normally think of when we think about accuracy. However, I think there's another component to accuracy when we think about information ecosystem sources, and that's integrity. Integrity is essentially the institutionalized or integrated value associated with being a reliable source. So when you think about the integrity of an information ecosystem source, what you're really thinking about is sort of its overall value of and commitment to being a reliable channel or conduit of information. And integrity isn't a all or nothing thing, and it isn't a one and done kind of phenomenon. It's something that must be maintained. And so when you're thinking about integrity, there are a number of things you might want to look for to get a sense of the integrity of a source. On the one hand, do they actually have sort of institutional or encoded codes of conduct? Do they devote appropriate resources? Is there a culture about reliability at the institution? Do they correct errors? Do they correct errors only when caught or when they themselves discover them? And all of these things are indicative of this notion of integrity, this idea that we want to be a reliable conduit of information. I want to be a reliable conduit of information. And you can learn a lot about the integrity of a news source by observing what happens when something goes wrong, because things will go wrong. I'm sure there are errors, places in this text. And if people point them out to me, I hope that I exhibit integrity, that I immediately think about how I can go about changing, correcting those mistakes. So when a news source, some information source, misreports, gives a falsehood, gives less than well-evinced beliefs, what happens when that gets discovered, either by them or by the world or by another news source? And I give you a number of examples in the chapter. Examples like this fellow here, Stephen Randall Glass, who included falsifications and made up information in about 21 of the 47 stories he wrote for the New Republic. What did they do when they discovered this? Well, they fired him. There were consequences for him personally. They notified the world. They published an article explaining what had happened, apologizing for it, right? Talking about how they might change the culture, the criterion that they use in evaluating articles and so on. And this is the sort of thing you want to look for. Now, sometimes you get really good examples of this, and sometimes you maybe see institutions or individuals fall short of the ideal. But you definitely do not want to trust yourself, even to sources that you feel might be reliable in certain cases, to sources that don't seem to exhibit this commitment to integrity, that don't seem to want over the long haul to be good, reliable conduits of information. And as I say, this comes in degrees. And so in the chapter, I talk about this phenomenon of yellow journalism. Yellow journalism isn't quite counterfeit news. These aren't people making things up, but they are veering away. They're sacrificing a bit of their integrity and their reliability in an effort to usually to make money. Now, two people I mentioned probably most prominently are the historic figures that inspired the name yellow journalism, namely Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. And they both had periods of time when they were in the newspaper industry where they had somewhat shaky integrity, where they tended to appeal to people's sensationalism, where they tended to distort the way they presented information to make it more popular. They were selling newspapers for a penny and were in direct competition with each other in major markets. As I say, they didn't veer off into counterfeit news. Right? So Pulitzer ultimately kind of changed the way he wanted to practice news. He ultimately endowed the Pulitzer Prizes so that he could promote good journalism. And Hearst, even, who didn't have a sort of public change of course so much, he did, though, emphasize, for instance, a much more extensive coverage of international news in the newspapers that he owned and operated. And so yellow journalism still falls within the purview of journalism. It just is a situation where they are sacrificing a bit of their integrity, their commitment to being reliable news conduits in order to pump up sales. And the pressures for this are constant, both in the past and today. Things were very competitive in those major markets for Hearst and Pulitzer, and things are even more competitive with even more players who can get into the game with even less skin, as it were. And so the temptation towards yellow journalism is certainly there. And we find that this can be problematic in terms of what gets covered, how much it gets covered, and more importantly, what doesn't get covered, as we'll see.